It's the first European race of the 2023 Formula One season, and two men in particular have been waiting a very long time for this race to happen. It's not as early as they expected due to the cancellation of the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, but George Russell and Lewis Hamilton, the two Mercedes drivers, have been desperate for their team to bring the major update kit that they've needed since the start of the year. The Mercedes W14, since its very first run, has proven to be something of a troubled machine. The drivers don't particularly like the driving position. They feel they sit a little bit too close to the front axle. That's all to do a little bit with the weight distribution and the overall aerodynamic concept of the car. The team can't do too much about that because in season changing a monocoque, that's a pretty difficult thing to do, very expensive as well in a cost-capped era. However, the big upgrade package has brought some really fundamental items, and I know everybody's been talking about the side pods, but that's not where I'm going to start, because for me, the most exciting part of this upgrade package is actually the front suspension. Now, I'm going to show you what the team started the season with and what they were using at the Miami Grand Prix. Here we can see George Russell bumping over a curb. Now, take a look at the arrangement of some of the suspension components. You can see here the position of the front upper wishbone element, and then you can see here the front lower wishbone element, as well as the pushrod. Now, these components have been on the car since it was launched. It's a fairly conventional layout and something the team are probably going to expect to stick with all the way through the season. However, take note of the inboard mounting point of that front suspension part. Just down here, not the pushrod. Don't get confused with the pushrod mounting, which is this section here. This is the point we want to look at here, the wishbone mounting point, because that is a really fundamental part of any car design. That wishbone mounting point, it contains the front wheel tether to stop the wheels bouncing off in an accident. They're a really important safety part of all of these F1 cars. And it sits just on the leading edge of the front bulkhead of the car. In fact, you can see little recesses where it used to be mounted, because as the team arrived in Europe and for the Monaco Grand Prix, we got to see something completely different. Mercedes has completely redesigned the front suspension of this car. Now you can see the wishbone positioning. That's the front upper wishbone. You can see that's much higher and actually further rearward on the chassis than it was in Miami. The pushrod remains much the same, though it has been fundamentally reshaped. The shroud around it is a very different shape indeed, whereas the rear section, the rear leg of the upper wishbone, is pretty much in the same position. The mounting point on that hasn't changed, but that would have been a massive structural challenge for the team to do. Then the lower wishbone, similar story. It's in the same position roughly as it was in Miami, but look, it's a much thicker design than it was. But the massive challenge here for me is that inboard mounting point. Look how much higher than it was. Now, if you want to bring down to where it used to sit, that pickup point was down here somewhere. So it's a big move rearward and upwards. And that's made the team have to do a really massive job of engineering. The car in Miami, well, that flew back. So those three chassis were flown back from Miami on a big aeroplane, taken back to the factory in Brackley. And the team had to strip those cars down completely and then get them rebuilt with the new suspension layout in time to ship them to the Imola Grand Prix. Even though that race didn't happen, the cars arrived with these new parts on. I asked the team about, look, this is a massive job. Will you have to have put on an entirely new monocoque for this? The team have explained no, because of the cost cap, they were unable to afford, within the cost cap restrictions, building completely new chassis for this suspension layout. So they had to modify the existing three chassis by putting new mounting points further upwards and rearwards on that monocoque, get those parts designed, get the structures tested, get them approved, get the aerodynamic shapes of them working in the wind tunnel and in CFD, then get them bolted onto the car in time for the Imola Grand Prix when they've only got the car for a few days between coming back from Miami and setting off for the north of Italy. That's pretty incredible when you consider the sheer amount of engineering work going on. And when you take a more detailed look at the suspension legs, you can get a bit more of an understanding of what these different parts consist of. Because if you have a look at the actual suspension parts themselves, these elements, the suspension legs, they are actually just thin carbon fibre shrouds over a structural part that runs through the middle of the suspension elements. Now, those parts, the structural bits, they're never particularly attractive to see. They're not that swoopy aerodynamic shape. They're more likely to be a fairly blocky 90-degree right angle bit of carbon fibre. Still very beautifully engineered, but just not as sexy looking as the external pieces. And a lot of those pieces for the Monaco Grand Prix, of course, have to be changed to allow the car to have the adequate steer angle to get around that really tight hairpin around halfway around the lap. So this may even be a Monaco specification version of the new front suspension that they designed to introduce in Imola. So even more of a massive job of work. But then we start talking about the aerodynamic impact of this new front suspension layout, because while there are some benefits to the suspension design, some people are talking about anti-dive, anti-squat characteristics, the big reason that the suspension layouts as they are on modern Formula One car is all to do with aerodynamic performance rather than pure vehicle dynamics performance, though that does play a role. And you can see a little bit of that over here. You can see this bulge, these characteristic bulge Mercedes have been running for a long time now. That's had to be completely reshaped all the way through, because that shape of suspension, completely different. The bulge has to be reshaped, and they've had to change the aerodynamic packaging on the side of the car. And that's affected everything downstream of it, which brings us quite neatly to the overall design of the car. The side pods, that's what everybody's been talking about, isn't it? Well, this is what the team had for most of the season so far. And you can see quite distinctively what people call the zero side pod just down here. And you've got that duct there, and it's essentially just a vertical letterbox, if you like, just feeding air into the cooling system underneath the bodywork. And there's not much of a side pod round here at all. It's very tight, big old section of floor exposed along here, and pretty much the side pod disappears under the body with the cooling system underneath that, very much as it is. Let's go back a bit though, because we need to take a look at where this concept first came from. And this is something Mercedes believed was a baked-in advantage they introduced on the W13 at the end of last season when the new regulations were introduced. When we first saw the Mercedes roll out of the garage for the first time, it was an interesting design, but it seemed fairly conventional. Nobody got too excited about the design of the still quite compact side pods, a little bit boxy, but as you can see here, it's still a conventional side pod shape. This was at the pre-season running in Barcelona over a year ago now. And everybody went, well, the Mercedes, it looks like a Mercedes built to the new regulations. It's pretty much of a muchness. Though when the teams arrived in Bahrain, they all got a bit of a shock, because Mercedes seemed to have forgotten to bring its side pods with it. In place of that very boxy, fairly conventional design of side pod, we had this very distinctive little slit of a radiator duct and almost no side pod whatsoever. And the upper front impact structure, because there was no side pod to put it into, sat exposed in its own little housing up here, which caused a little bit of controversy, particularly with Red Bull early in the season, because the mirror support here just sits out on its own as well, exposed on that upper side impact structure support. And one of the reasons the team had to do that is the side impact structures have to be located on every single car. You have two either side. You have an upper impact structure and a lower impact structure, as you can see in this picture I took of this car during that test in Bahrain with the bodywork removed. You can see it quite clearly. Well, those structures are all designed and supplied by Red Bull Racing, of all people, but every single team uses an identical structure, which is why you don't really get that side impact test anymore for vehicle homologation at the start of the season. However, that is such a core baked-in part of this car concept that when the season started with the 2023 Mercedes, they'd pretty much followed the same route. You can see again, you have this side impact structure housing just sitting out underneath the mirror supports, and the lower impact structure is housed in this bulge on the edge of the floor. That's pretty much what they expected to be going for the rest of the season. But of course, we arrived in Monaco and saw this, a complete redesign of the concept. Far more conventional, shall we say, on 2023 Formula One car design. They still had to retain certain parts of the design. You can still see here quite clearly that exposed side impact structure support, almost in that upper wing design. But the side pod now is much wider. running all the way along here, and you can see it's dropping back all the way along there. It's a really conventional side pod design for this era of car. You can still see that bulge there for the lower side impact structure, but there's a little bit less floor exposed at the base of that side impact structure, or the base of that side pod. And that makes things a little bit, well, very different, in fact, in terms of the aerodynamic performance of the car. And you can see that slightly more clearly when you take a look at the radiator duct inlet itself. You see this big conventional shape underneath the side impact support structure here, and you can see that all under there. And that's a complete change. And that change is not just aerodynamic. Underneath the bodywork, Mercedes has not only changed the cooling ducting, so it's not just that duct you see, there's actually a duct within the duct, there's sort of carbon fibre channel, almost a canal, that runs under the bodywork that you can't see in this picture, that takes you down to the heat exchangers, the coolers, the radiators if you want to call them that. And those radiators have been redesigned as part of this upgrade package. The layout's pretty similar, the same things are cooled on the same sides of the car, but the design of the actual radiators themselves have been modified ever so slightly. So that adds to the job of work that the team have had to do. So it's not just an aerodynamic change, it's not just a structural change, it's also a cooling system change. So a huge amount of work to change these cars from one to the other. Remember, they just had a few days between getting back from Miami and jetting off to Imola. Now, there are some interesting details around here. So this is not a half-baked design. This is something Mercedes have put a huge amount of effort into. Now, we've seen, wait for it, the sticky downy bit that we've seen at a few races on this Mercedes actually goes back to last season. They had this section here underneath the side impact structure. They had an aerodynamic element, but that's become much thicker and much more detailed on this car. It's longer as well on this upgrade. So clearly Mercedes finding a little bit more of a gain from that part of the car and channeling the air around the sidepod. But there are some really interesting other details. Let's just roll this slightly jerky footage forwards a little bit, because I want to show you some more of those details, because you can see very clearly now the shape of the new inlet, how the shape of that side impact structure housing has been reworked to channel air into that newly shaped radiator duct, which you can see here. And then you can see that sticky downy bit with a nice little sort of filleted section underneath, just underneath that, and then you can see the shape of where the side impact structure itself is. The side impact structure hasn't changed. The locations are exactly the same as I said before, but they've worked around that limitation. That driving position also still sits quite close to the front axle. Again, the team unable to change that in the time available. But you do have some interesting details here in particular. Now, we've seen Mercedes running these little downward pointing winglets on the side of the car for a few since last season and for most of this year as well. But also down here, have Mercedes essentially cheekily reinvented the barge board? Now, these were little bits of aerodynamic performance the performance generating parts that you'd see around the part in front of the side pods on many cars. Now, here we get a much clearer view of that part I'm talking about. You can see those two little winglets up here. That's all, and Mercedes have talked quite a lot about those, just working on the flow into the coolers, into that duct. But this section here, look at this. This is a barge board, and it's the best name I can come up with for it. It's not just a sticky uppy bit, that is the beginnings. It's a nascent barge board. It's the sort of taking us right back to the origination of barge boards in the sort of late 1970s and early 1980s, where you saw those panels and they started to get so complicated and so beautiful. It's just sort of coming back, and I think a few teams are going to be taking a good hard look at that. But that's not all. The changes downstream of the radiator duct are also super important. Take a look at the top of the side pod, and now we're going to start to see some real 2023 Formula One trends kicking in. Now, since Ferrari introduced the F175 last season with those deeply scalloped, almost like a soap dish style of side pod tops, a lot of other teams have taken note of that, and it's believed to be a drag-reducing shape. Mercedes had already employed that shape higher up on the engine cover. We talked about that earlier in the season when I took a close-up look at the car in the pit lane. Well, we see that shape returning once again on the Mercedes. Have a look at this. There it is again. Very much influenced by the Ferrari, that very clear dished upper surface of the side pod. But Ferrari also have those big cooling louvers, and Mercedes haven't really gone deep into that on the car that they're actually running in Monaco, but they do have two small little cooling louvers. I have seen photographs of some of the interchangeable panels that Mercedes have got to go in that section, and it does look far more Ferrari-like, big louvers, but they just don't need that much cooling around Monaco, which is a surprise. If you don't need it around Monaco on a hot day, I'm not sure where you're going to need it. Possibly the Hungaroring, maybe. That shape, though, it does look familiar, and not just because of Ferrari, not just because of Aston Martin. Take a look at this. This is the Alpine in Monaco, and this is the concept that Mercedes are sort of going down the route of. Now, Alpine have made their scalloped side pods much, much deeper than they were, much closer to what Aston Martin had from the start of this season, these deep valleys down the side pods of the car. And that's the sort of direction that Mercedes are exploring. They haven't just gone out and copied Red Bull. The only other team that's really got a Red Bull style car is McLaren. So I think they're going more down the Aston Martin Alpine route of design. And as you can see, look at the deep dishes, the deep cuts in the side of the Alpine, very much like the Aston Martin. Mercedes, a little bit tamer than that at this point of the season, but I do think there's a little bit more to come. So you can see how much steeper the drop down here is than it used to be on the previous iteration of the car, and you can see that very Ferrari-influenced shape at the rear of that side pod. So Mercedes clearly exploring that area that Aston Martin have gone. Will they go as extreme as Aston Martin? Well, the option is open to them. Mercedes, let's not forget, uses the same transmission, the same power unit as Aston Martin. So what Aston Martin can do, in theory, Mercedes can do, but it's not a simple challenge in terms of the aerodynamics. And then just looking from the side, you can see an overview of that side pod, and you can see that dishing down, that deep scalloping section at the rear of the side pod. Again, a little bit out. I wouldn't say they've copied Aston Martin. I think actually the influences, as I say, come from Ferrari, but it's a clear direction of travel for quite a few teams. It's a clear concept change for Mercedes, and they're gonna have to learn how to get the most out of it. And I don't think Monaco is a particularly good track to really understand how a new package is working. Barcelona, the next race out, is probably more representative for all of the teams. And I suspect we're going to see some new floor parts from Mercedes. This is pretty similar to what we've seen Mercedes running all season so far, along at least the edge of the floor. I think there's probably a bit more performance for Mercedes to find down there, but they're still trying to understand this new package, how it performs and how it works all the way around the lap. And that's not all of it. Mercedes, of course, bought a bigger high downforce rear wing, as you always expect around Monaco. They also made some detail changes, and these are the little bits that have a big impact, but perhaps people don't talk enough about. They're winglet packages just on the inside of the rear wheel. They just introduced a slight revision to their rear brake duct winglets, is what we call this area here. And there's a bit of freedom for the teams to work in this area, generate a bit more load at the rear of the car, and try and improve the performance that way. So lots of little details like that right across the Mercedes, and a lot more to come. But introducing a package like this at Monaco is extraordinarily brave, because core to that new package is that new front suspension. And what is most at risk of driver errors around Monaco? It's that front suspension.